Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the Rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
Last December, All Saints worshipers wrote notes to men in solitary housing units at Pelican Bay and Corcoran prisons. A note from Carissa Baldwin McGinnis was enclosed, and not long afterward, Carissa started receiving many very moving cards and letters of response, each expressing enormous gratitude for these notes and for our work in ending prolonged solitary confinement. So let me give you a taste. Here's from one. I wish to thank you for your actions to end prolonged solitary confinement. Director of Peace and Justice, wow. Never knew a church that was that serious about social justice, and one that has a female priest. This is great. There's a great need for such spiritual progressives. Another said, as a man who's survived 17 years in the SHU, now I cannot adequately express my gratitude for the church and individual support which you've given. Another, it is rare with all the lock them up and throw away the key mentality that permeates through society that someone, let alone complete strangers, find the time to write and let one know that they are not forgotten. Another, it sure feels good to get a note from someone after all this time in solitary housing unit, 13 years. To read a note and a card makes me feel alive and not forgotten. So today at our action table, here in the forum or on the lawn, we again are asking you to take a few minutes to write a note to men in the solitary housing unit. We've provided some suggestions for the notes, and we want to be sure that each of the men on our list gets a note from our parish. Number two, a very important bill that would limit solitary confinement to juvenile facilities failed to pass out of the Senate Public Safety Committee last week when 2 Los Angeles senators abstained. So we want you to pick up an action alert sheet at the action table and make 2 brief but very important phone calls tomorrow to the offices of these 2 senators urging a yes vote when the bill is again heard in committee this Tuesday. The solitary housing mess is torture. And we are very happy to have with us today the founder of the anti-torture movement in the U.S. He helped start an organization against torture, of which we are members, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And for it to discern that we are torturing citizens in our own country through these prolonged sentences of solitary confinement was quite a help to those of us in the social action movement. George Hunsinger is the Princeton Theological Seminary's Hazel Thompson McCord Professor of Systematic Theology. He earned his BA from Harvard University Divinity School and his doctorate degrees from Yale. He served as director of the seminary's Center for Bart Studies from 1997 to 2001. He has broad interests in the history and theology of the Reformed tradition and in quote-unquote generous orthodoxy as a way beyond the modern liberal conservative impasse in theology and church. An ordained Presbyterian minister, he was a major contributor to the New Presbyterian Catechism, and he teaches courses on the doctrine of the Holy Spirit in the Reformed tradition, the theology of the Lord's Supper, the theology of John Calvin, and classical and recent Reform theology. He has been on sabbatical for several months here in Pasadena, and we have had the privilege of having him worship with us, and now we have the privilege of his teaching before us. Will you please warmly welcome our friend George Hunsinger.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a delight for me to be here. I did speak in this very room back in 2008. It was before my book was available, and now it's on the table over here if any of you might be interested afterwards. Torture is a moral issue. It's true that I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister, but I think it should also be mentioned that I'm a closet Episcopalian, and that I often worship in an Episcopal congregation in Princeton. Well, we have a very limited amount of time. Let me just plunge right in and begin by saying a little bit about the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which I founded in 2006. As Ed mentioned, All Saints Church has been one of our most enthusiastic supporters, and I'm very grateful for this. Ed wrote 2 editorials for us recently that appeared in the Pasadena Star News, and then they were picked up around the country. All politics is local, and that's a very important effort to get it into the local paper and to see it go out from there. And then also your vestry has produced a resolution against torture. It's called the Resolution Against Torture. It came out in 2010. You can see it on the table out in the yard again. But this statement is not specifically about solitary confinement. So maybe something could be added to it at some point, or maybe another statement along these lines might be in the offing at some point. NRCAT started, when the Abu Ghraib photographs came out in April of 2004, I knew it was not just a few rotten apples at the bottom of the barrel. I had been concerned about our government's involvement in torture since the days of the Vietnam War. I don't have time to go into that because we're very limited in time. But I had a history of concern and involvement. And after a year went by and there was no outcry from the churches to speak of, this just weighed very heavily on me. And I thought, well, I'm just one person, but let me see what I can do. And one thing led to another. We had a big conference in Princeton in 2006. This book, the proceedings, more or less, of the conference. And that is how our organization got started. So we were at first concerned about torture used against detainees in Guantanamo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But now we're working, and we continue to work, to see that those who authorized and carried out the torture of hundreds, if not thousands, of 9/11 detainees will someday be held accountable. We worked for President Obama's executive orders. We worked on that project for over a year, and it was an amazing experience to see it actually happen. When he issued them on his second day in office. But there have been disappointments since then. We continue to work for a commission of inquiry and a special prosecutor to hold the people involved in torture accountable, not only those who conducted the torture, but especially those who authorized it. The real crimes were not committed in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and Bagram Air Force Base in Washington, in Afghanistan. The real crimes were committed in Washington. And we have a continuing agenda there. Nevertheless, we have also recently come to see how important it is to look at torture that goes on in our own backyards, and especially through solitary confinement and solitary max prisons. Our core principle is the inherent worth and dignity of all people, even if they've committed crimes. And a part of our work is to respect that dignity for people who are held in our own prisons. Let me make 7 quick points, and I really will try to make it quick, but I have 7. First, prolonged solitary confinement is widespread in the United States. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. And the vast majority of our prisoners are held in long-term solitary confinement. It is with no pride that we can say that the United States is perhaps the world leader in solitary confinement. In 1983, there was only one prison where solitary confinement was widespread. That was the Federal Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. By the 1990s, the number of such prisons in our country had increased to 40. Second, what is solitary confinement like? How does it affect the prisoners subjected to it? According to the United Nations and respected human rights organizations, as Ed already mentioned, prolonged solitary confinement must be recognized as a form of torture. It causes severe and often irreversible damage to the prisoners who undergo it. Solitary confinement cells usually measure only 6 by 9 feet or as much as 8 by 10 feet. Some have bars. More often they have solid metal doors. In California, some of them have little holes in them. That's what that is. That's a close-up of a door to a solitary confinement cell in Pelican Bay. Meals usually come through slots in these doors, as do any communications with the prison staff. Within these cells, inmates live lives of enforced idleness. They're denied the opportunity to work or to attend any prison programs. They are sometimes banned from having televisions, radios, art supplies, or even reading material in their cells. They're just there alone, often 23 hours a day. Sometimes they get an hour where they get exercise out in some prison yard, but even that can be done in a solitary fashion. In California, according to testimony given by the Undersecretary of Operations for the state in 2011, the average term in solitary confinement in this state is 6.8 years. Studies have shown that solitary confinement that lasts for more than 10 days begins to cause serious psychological and mental harm. People begin to deteriorate. Some inmates in the United States have been kept in solitary confinement for 10, 20, or even as many as 40 years. Perhaps you saw the article recently. Amnesty International has a case in Mississippi of 2 men who have been held in solitary for 40 years. Following extensive interviews with Pelican Bay inmates in the so-called solitary housing units, SHUs or SHUs, Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist, found that solitary confinement induces a psychiatric disorder characterized by hypersensitivity to external stimuli, hallucinations, panic attacks, cognitive deficits, obsessive thinking, paranoia, and a litany of other physical and psychological problems. Psychological assessments of Pelican Bay solitary confined prisoners indicates high rates of anxiety, nervousness, obsessive ruminations, anger, violent fantasies, nightmares, trouble sleeping, as well as dizziness, perspiring hands, and heart palpitations. Some prisoners, as a result of prolonged solitary confinement, begin to lose their grasp on sanity and deteriorate mentally and psychologically. Self-mutilation, depression, suicide, and other psychotic symptoms are not uncommon. Prisoners in solitary confinement begin doing things like talking to the insects in their cells or banging their heads against the wall until they bleed. An article appeared last month in the New York Times about a particular prisoner who had been held at Pelican Bay, and if the lights will dim, let's look at a slideshow that accompanied that article. And I'll give a little background about the man whose case we'll be looking at. Here, go ahead, dim the lights. He was picked up for having a hairline crack in his windshield, and they found little packets of methamphetamine in his car, so he went to prison, and then they found some sort of drawing, you'll see it in the slideshow, that they thought was incriminating, made him seem as if he were a part of a gang. And so for this infraction, he ended up in prolonged solitary confinement. So this is not the worst case, but it's not an unimportant case either. I'll read what the Times wrote here. Thousands of inmates alleged to have gang ties, even those who have not been violent or disruptive while in prison, have been isolated in units like the one at Pelican Bay, where they remained for years, or in some cases, decades. Ernesto Lira spent 8 years confined for 22 or more hours a day in a 7.6 foot by 11.6 foot cell, despite his protest that he was not associated with a gang. So he was apprehended because he had a hairline crack in his windshield. There was little packets of some sort of drugs in his car. He was not a violent prisoner, but he was associated with a gang, and he ended up spending 8 years in solitary confinement here in California. Here you see the way in which food is passed back and forth and communications take place. You can see those holes again in the door. A few dispute the threat posed by prison gangs or the murders, assaults, and drug smuggling and other mayhem they are responsible for. I mean, we're not trying to minimize the problems. And the problems are magnified in California, where correctional institutions are so overcrowded to this day that the Supreme Court has ordered the state to reduce its prison population. Here we see a guard placing handcuffs on a prisoner before taking him out of a solitary confinement cell. California could join a growing number of states motivated by economic factors and research suggesting that isolating large numbers of prisoners is ineffective in reducing overall violence, I'll come back to that point, and are reducing their reliance on long-term solitary confinement. California could join this group. Here's Mr. Luca, the man we saw at the beginning, standing in the doorway of his cell as guards observe. California, prodded by 2 hunger strikes, as you know, by inmates at Pelican Bay last year, the advice of consultants called in to assess the practice, and the example of other states where gang membership alone is not considered sufficient to segregate an inmate, is now proposing changes in the state's gang policy that could decrease the use of isolation. Here we see a guard delivering trays of food to inmates in the general population area of the prison. You get a sense of how grim this is. Those proposed changes, by the way, are not regarded by human rights groups and church activists as anywhere close to being sufficient. In 2011, there were almost 2,000 gang-related homicides, attempted homicides, and violent attacks on staff members or other inmates in state prisons, according to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Here we see weapons confiscated from prisoners at Pelican Bay State Prison. The reason for resorting to solitary is symbolized by this, even though it's highly ineffective. Most states identify inmates who are members of prison gangs, and gang members account for a large percentage of the prisoners held in solitary confinement. What happened to the photo here? I'm not sure what happened to. Okay. Well, we missed one. Let's go on. California's policy has been among the most severe in the country, sending not only full gang members, but also inmates found to associate regularly with gangs, or even suspected, in the case of Mr. Lira, of associating with gangs, to one of the state's 3 super maximum security facilities. This is the exercise yard that inmates use when they get out 1 hour a day, 1 out of 24 hours a day. While prisoners sent to the lockdown units for a disciplinary offense get out after a set term, up to 3 years, for the murder of an inmate, for example, those sent for gang affiliation are held indefinitely. Their status reviewed every 6 years, an inmate giving a pinky shake to a guard. That's what we see there. Mr. Lear's confinement was based partly on this drawing found in a cell of his, if it will show up. Yeah, here it is. Yeah. Which officials said contained gang symbols. I think it was later shown that somebody else put it in there. He didn't have anything to do with it. A federal judge deemed it and other evidence used against him unreliable. But it was enough to put him in solitary confinement for all those years. Mr. Lear was paroled in 2004, but the civil rights lawsuit that vindicated him was resolved in his favor only last year, 2011. Mr. Lear and his girlfriend, Vicki Luna, in her house in Planada, California, with an album of artwork given to Mr. Lear by other inmates while he was in jail. Here we see Mr. Lear with his girlfriend's 2-year-old granddaughter. Mr. Lear is now 48 years old. He's tried to explain to his grown children why he was gone from their lives for so long. I say, I had to go do time for what I did, but I didn't think I was going to be stuck in some hole where I couldn't reach out to you in a phone call, he said. Okay, so Mr. Lear battles with depression, insomnia, and other symptoms that a psychiatric expert testified are a legacy of his confinement at Pelican Bay. Since his parole in 2004, he has been in and out of other prisons for parole violations and has been arrested for drunken driving and other infractions. He's edgy, becomes anxious in crowds. He avoids movies, shopping malls, and other public places. In the article, the journalist who interviewed him said that he walked up and was pacing around the room anxiously during the whole time of the interview. Yeah, people are damaged, perhaps for life, by their experience in solitary confinement. My third point, who gets placed in solitary confinement? You might think it would be the worst of the worst. That's what we're told. People who have a history of some extreme violent behavior. Well, that Mr. Lear didn't. That's true of some of them in solitary confinement, but not the majority. And of course, it would differ from prison to prison. But solitary confinement is used to punish people who have committed crimes while in prison. To punish or control violent behavior, to segregate a prisoner for his or her own protection, and for inmates on death row. But many in solitary confinement are actually mentally ill. By some estimates, at least 30% of those in solitary confinement in our country are mentally ill. One corrections officer with experience in Oregon said it's not unusual to have up to 1/2 of the segregation beds occupied by mentally ill inmates. Over the past 30 years, prisons and jails have become the nation's largest inpatient psychiatric centers. Solitary confinement cells in particular are now used to warehouse thousands of prisoners with mental illness. Juveniles are also held in solitary confinement. While juveniles are often placed in solitary for their own protection, the experience of confinement is particularly damaging to young minds. What we're looking at is punishment, a form of punishment so severe that it violates our values as a nation, as people of faith, and as fellow human beings. What is at issue here is punishment so severe that it amounts to torture. My fourth point, how many prisoners does California keep in solitary confinement? As I mentioned at the beginning, there are close to 11,000 prisoners in California in solitary confinement. Let me read from an article last month that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. It's quoting a man named Peter Shea, who heads the Center for Human Rights and Constitutional Law. California, he says, holds more prisoners in solitary confinement than any other state in the United States or any other nation on earth. The treatment of these prisoners is barbaric, and numerous experts agree amounts to torture. Prisoners, as we know, have joined together to petition the United Nations, prisoners from Pelican Bay, to intervene by conducting on-site investigations, permitting Red Cross visits, and ultimately they hope they will get a ruling that California's policy on isolated segregation does amount to torture and violates well-established international human rights norms. Then, in another article about the same time from the LA Times, the same expert, Peter Shea, said, "We have California treating several thousand prisoners in much the same way the U.S. government treats enemy combatants held in Guantanamo." See, torture always comes home. It's not just something that takes place abroad. If it takes place abroad, it will come home. There's a feedback loop in this. That's why accountability is so important to stop it. The article also noted that last summer's hunger strike had drawn attention to the fact that all but 26 of the nearly 11,000 prisoners who were isolated as of July 1st were being held there because of suspected gang affiliations, not for other specific actions or rule violations, and that nearly 300 had been there for more than a decade. My fifth point, prolonged solitary confinement is ineffective. Despite the seriousness of the problems that it's trying to address, it doesn't address them very well. It does not reduce prison violence, and recidivism rates are high. Prolonged solitary confinement and supermax prisons do not reduce violence, nor are they effective in reducing recidivism. In fact, a Commission on Prison Safety found, quote, troubling evidence that the distress of living and working in this environment of solitary confinement actually causes violence between staff and prisoners. The study also concluded that after 10 days, solitary confinement has no positive benefits, only negative ones. A person who has been brutalized by solitary confinement for 5 years, say, can one day be out on the street going shopping or just walking around. These people are released directly into the community. There's no opportunity for adaptive conditioning or therapy. And as we've seen in the case of Mr. Lira, many of the released prisoners talk about being overwhelmed with the stimuli, paranoid with all people. It's a factor for all survivors of torture. Anxious, feeling the need to hide or lash out, fearful that they can't control their behavior, and many of them can't. They don't control their behavior, and they end up back in prison. My sixth point, better solutions are available for the problems that solitary seeks to address. In an important article from 2009, which brought the solitary confinement scandal to national attention, the New Yorker magazine reported that after seeing how ineffective solitary confinement is, British authorities have now adopted a better approach. Beginning in the 1980s, they gradually adopted a strategy that focused on preventing prison violence. They reduced isolation and offered inmates opportunity for work, education, and special programming to increase social ties and social skills. The prisoners were housed in small, stable units of fewer than 10 people in individual cells. They could receive mental health treatment and earn rights for more exercise. There was an incentive system, more phone calls, contact visits. I mean, one of the hardest things about being in solitary confinement for people is not only they have no contact by means of communication, they have no physical contact with anyone. There are lots of stories about prisoners initiating conflict and fights with guards just so they'll have some physical contact, no matter how beat up they get. It's the only time in their lives while they're in solitary that they get to have contact physically with another human being, contact visits, and even access to cooking facilities in this British program. They're allowed to air their grievances. The government sets up an independent body of inspectors to track the results and enable adjustments based on the data. In other words, this is an intelligent problem, an intelligent solution to a real problem. The results have been pretty impressive. The use of long-term isolation in England is now negligible They virtually don't have it anymore. In all of England, there are fewer prisoners in extreme custody than there are in the state of California. And the other countries of Europe have, with a similar focus on small units and violent prevention, achieved a similar outcome. My seventh and last point, solitary confinement is very expensive. There's a practical consequence to supermax prisons as well. Supermax prisons cost 3 or 4 times more than a regular prison. This works in our favor. I want to make the humanitarian argument. To me, that's enough. But the economic argument is also very important, and people who might not be persuaded on one ground can be persuaded on another. The costs are much greater to maintain this inhumane system than other forms of imprisonment. There are several reasons for this. Supermax prisons are considerably more costly to build. Staffing costs are much higher. Prisoners are usually required to be escorted by 2 or more officers any time they leave their cells. And work that in other prisons would be performed by prisoners, such as cooking and cleaning, must be done by paid staff. A 2007 estimate from Arizona put the annual cost of placing someone in solitary confinement at approximately $50,000 a year, compared to only about $20,000 a year for an average prisoner. It's more costly to keep a prisoner in solitary confinement than it would be to send him or her to Princeton University. Although they might learn more in prison. Remember that today there are as many as 80,000 prisoners locked up in this country in soul-destroying solitary confinement. And I did find some statistics, it's a little repetitious, but I'll do it again, from Solitary Watch, a national organization, about solitary confinement in California, with the 1,100 inmates in this SHU, Security Housing Unit, and 400 more in Administrative Segregation Units, ASU. Pelican Bay Prison has a yearly budget of $180 million. I mean, think of that in the midst of all this budgetary crisis that we're suffering under. For last year, last year we have statistics, 2010, 2011, the annual costs for inmate were as follows: roughly $71,000 per SHU inmate, roughly $78,000 for ASU inmate, and $58,000 for a general population inmate. At this rate, the total cost of holding each inmate in the SHU approaches almost $500,000. Let me come to my conclusion about what NRCAT is doing and how you can help. How can the United States, with a ban on cruel and unusual punishment enshrined in our Constitution, how can we be using torture as a routine means of criminal sanction? And as people of faith who believe deeply in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, how can we ignore what is going on in these supermax prisons right in our own backyards? We can't. That's why NRCAT has decided that it needs to address this issue. We decided that if we seek to rid the U.S. of torture, it has to include the use of torture in our own prisons. So NRCAT has now set as one of its main priorities ending the use of long-term solitary confinement in U.S. prisons. And I can report some good news. Last year, NRCAT was successful in what was essentially a pilot project of reducing the incidence of solitary confinement in the state of Maine by 70%. We had busloads of ministers going to a solitary confinement facility, a supermax prison in Maine. We had personal contact with the commissioner of prisons. We contacted state representatives. The incidence was reduced by 70%, and the state of Maine saved over $5 million a year. We now are starting efforts to reduce solitary confinement here in California, in Colorado, Texas, and in Virginia. we're working on legislation to end the shackling of women prisoners during labor. And let me mention, we're a very small organization. We're not talking about Amnesty International. We have a paid full-time staff of about 5 people, if you count everyone. And they are very dedicated, very qualified people who are underpaid. It's a continual struggle for us to raise the money we need so that we can do programs like this. So there are lots of ways that you can get involved. You could visit our website and see our statement against solitary confinement. And if you wanted to, you could sign it. You could get on our mailing list. We don't inundate people's mailboxes with emails, but we do give reasonable actions that people can take 2 or 3 times a month. When we get enough signatures from a particular state, we send the statement and those names to members of the state legislature and the governor, and we begin an advocacy effort to limit or end the use of solitary confinement in that state. Here at All Saints Action this Sunday, you will again be writing notes to men in SHU at Pelican Bay and Corcoran Prison, and you've heard how much that means to them. In California, NRCAT will be working as a partner of the new California Interfaith Campaign on solitary confinement. This is a very positive development for us to have this partnership, and we're supporting their efforts to seek redress through the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture. Let me close with a familiar passage from the Gospel of Matthew. It guides the thinking of all the Christian groups, including evangelicals and Catholics, with whom we work at NRCAT. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me." I hope you will continue to remain aware of this issue, and with your leadership, I'm sure you will, that you will sign the NRCAT statement, and that you will help us end the use of solitary confinement around the country, and especially here in California. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes for some questions, and there is one right there ready for you, Juliana. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I did want to ask, could you tell us how much the federal prisons and the federal system has to do with solitary confinement compared to the states?
You know, that's a really good question, and I'm afraid I don't have those statistics at my fingertips, but I can tell you where to find out. There's an organization that I cited called Solitary Watch, and they have all this information available. They have the best data about everything, state by state and nationally and so on. It's all online. Thank you.
Good morning. 2 points. One is a comment. I remember the Times article and specifically the lockup of gang members in the SHUs, that it was used in part for coercion, that is, give up the names of your gang members, tell them about your gang affiliations, and the condition for giving it up is getting released from the SHU. The second issue was a question, that is, state prisons have been under federal court order. Judge Thelton Henderson has been basically overseeing the prison systems. Has this issue been raised to Judge Henderson, and have you gotten any response there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, on the first point, you can see that people have an incentive to say anything. I mean, it's like the incentive you have to stop your torture, you know. So the information they're going to give is not necessarily reliable. It's just information that will get them out. And, you know, we need more judges like Judge Henderson.
Good morning. It's very upsetting to hear that juveniles are also held in solitary confinement. Would you give us a couple examples of why juveniles will be placed in solitary confinement?
Well, in California, it's especially related to the gang problem. And there are actually gangs in prisons. You know, another possible solution, beyond what the British are doing, be close to it, it has to do with what's called restorative justice. This is a burgeoning new approach to things. You'll be hearing more about it. What's this event coming up, Virginia?
Next August.
Next August? Loyola Marymount. It would take a whole presentation to talk about restorative practices, but for example, there was a high school in Philadelphia that was on the list of the 5 most dangerous high schools in the state, and they implemented restorative practices, which has to do with circles and victims and perpetrators conducting one another over time and working out penalties for the perpetrators agreed upon by the group and so on, but everybody gets a chance to be heard. And it turned that school around. And in San Francisco, they're in the process of implementing restorative practices throughout the school system for the entire city, beginning with elementary schools. My older daughter is involved in that in an elementary school, and I was up there last weekend, and they have the restorative practice questions posted right there on the door by the playground, and all the kids know about it and are taught about it. I can't go into details about what it is, but in some restorative circles, you don't speak unless you hold a stone or a stick. And there's a story about a little boy who ran up to my daughter. She has 2 children there in kindergarten and 2nd grade, and she helps out with the playground. A little boy ran up to her and said, "Mrs. Miracle, the stick." And she gave him the stick. He ran off with the stick, talked to his buddies. They passed it around. They resolved their problem. And then he ran back and gave it to her. And life went on. But see, they already have internalized these questions and procedures so that they can resolve their own conflicts. And I think that could happen within prisons, with juveniles. But you can see that solitary doesn't make things any better.
Last question.
Yeah, you made a point of the reductions that have been accomplished in Maine,
yes.
in the state of Maine.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about that? How long ago was it? Has it received the kind of publicity that it should have? Is it a model for other states?
It's brand new. It hasn't received much publicity except through NRCAT. You would know about it if you visited our website. I think it's a real breakthrough, and I think it shows that churches and religious communities at the state level can really make a difference on this question. I mean, the commissioner actually was very welcoming because he knew that solitary wasn't working, but he didn't feel he had enough popular support.
Thank you very much, George.